The morning began like a sigh across the mountains. Soft lights spilled over the ridges, pale and gold, the kind that doesn't shout the day awake, but hums it into being. Frost clung to the fence posts. A hawk drifted above the valley, circling the silence like it owned it. At the far edge of that silence stood a cabin, nothing grand, just wood and time holding hands. Its windows fogged with the breath of a small fire. Inside, an old man stirred the embers with a poker and waited for the crackle to sound like company. His name was Elias Boone, 57 years old, though the years sat heavier than the number. His face was weathered in the way only the West can shape a man, sun-bitten, lined deep by wind and regret. His hair had turned the color of mountain ash, and his eyes carried that distant calm of someone who'd already seen all the noise the world could make. He used to ride with the trail crews, back when his name was worth a handshake and a nod. He'd broken wild horses, fixed fences across half the territory, and led cattle through storms that would have broken lesser men. But now, when he rode into town, the younger hands looked through him, like the air between yesterday and today. Too old, they said. Too slow. Too quiet. He never argued. He'd just tip his hat and ride home, where the hills still remembered who he was. The cabin smelled of pine resin and coffee gone bitter on the stove. Elias poured a cup anyway. Steam curled around his fingers like ghosts of mornings that used to mean something. Outside, his horse, a grizzled roan named Hickory, pawed at the frozen ground. Elias stepped out, boots crunching in the snow. He brushed the animal's mane, speaking low, more to the air than to the beast. "Don't reckon they'll need us again this winter, boy." The horse snorted softly, a kind of answer that didn't argue or pity. Elias smiled a little at that. He liked creatures that didn't waste words. That he spent the morning chopping wood. The rhythm steadied him, gave the hours shape. Each swing was an echo of something he once was: strong, certain, useful. By midday, he sat on the porch with the axe laid beside him and watched the wind roll through the valley. It whispered through the sagebrush and over the frozen creek, carrying a tune only old men and mountains still knew. He thought about the men in town, all their noise and swagger, their bright shirts and loud talk. They reminded him of summer storms, quick to flash, quicker to fade. He used to be one of them once, before time sanded the shine off him and left something truer underneath. But truth doesn't feed a man, and the world doesn't pay for quiet. That evening, with the sun sinking red behind the peaks, Elias rode down to Dry Creek, a town barely clinging to its own name. The saloon lights flickered weakly, their glow trembling on the frost. The streets were nearly empty, just the blacksmith closing shop, a dog nosing through the dirt, and the faint music of a piano trying to sound hopeful inside the saloon. He tied Hickory to the post and walked slowly, his spurs barely whispering. The notice board by the door caught his eye. A single scrap of paper nailed to the wood, flapping like it was alive. "Help needed. Small ranch, East Range. Steady hand preferred. No name. No signature. No promise of pay. Just plain words." He stared at them longer than he meant to. Then, without much thought, he tore the paper free and folded it into his coat pocket. Inside the saloon, the laughter was young and sharp. A few ranchers, faces flushed with drink, were talking about some new rail line coming through the valley. Elias ordered coffee, the kind they make for men too proud for whiskey. One of the boys, no more than 20, looked him over and said, "You still out here working, old-timer? I'd thought you hung your saddle up by now." Elias smiled faintly, the kind that hides 100 answers. "Still got hands that work," he said. They laughed, not cruelly, but without knowing how not to. He didn't blame them. The young always think time owes them kindness. When he stepped back outside, night had settled full. The stars looked close enough to reach if a man still had the will. The wind bit his face, but it felt clean, honest. He mounted Hickory, tugged the reins gently. The horse moved slow along the frozen trail home, hooves clicking like a metronome for thoughts he'd never say aloud. He thought about the paper in his coat, about the line steady hand preferred. That was all he had left, steadiness. Maybe that was enough for someone. Somewhere as he rode past the ridge, he paused to look back. The town lights shimmered weak and far, like the last embers of a campfire. Ahead, the valley stretched into shadow, endless, quiet, alive. He felt something stir in his chest. Not hope, not yet, but something near it. A pulse. A reminder that he whispered to no one. Maybe the years forgot me, but the land still remembers. And with that, Elias Boone rode into the dark, not chasing a dream, not running from an ending, just following the quiet where it led. The mountains swallowed the sound of his horse, and the night folded around him like an old friend returning to keep him company. The trail east of Dry Creek wound through land the maps forgot to name. The hills were low, the sky wide, and the wind seemed to have nowhere better to be. Dust rose with every hoof step, swirling around Elias Boone like old ghosts following slow company at BY midday. The sun burned pale against a washed sky. Elias rode in silence, chewing on the memory of that tattered paper he'd found pinned to the saloon door. Small ranch. East Range. Steady hand preferred, he didn't expect much. He'd been turned away enough times to learn that hope is a fragile horse to ride. Still he went. Because a man who stays still too long begins to forget what his own name sounds like in the wind. BY late afternoon. He found it. A stretch of land hemmed by a fence that had seen better years. Beyond it, a weather-beaten house stood against the horizon, stubborn as a prayer. Smoke rose from the chimney, thin and uncertain. Elias dismounted, dusted off his coat, and walked the path up to the porch. A dog barked once, deep, territorial, but not angry, then trotted back to the shade. From the doorway stepped a woman. She wasn't young, but she carried herself with the kind of grace that doesn't need youth to shine. Her hair was dark but threaded with silver, tied back in a way that spoke of purpose, not vanity. Her clothes were plain, denim and linen, worn soft by work. But it was her eyes that stilled him, sharp as flint, steady as dusk. Clara Vale. Her face looked carved from the same quiet that shaped the land around her. Not fragile, not cold, just honest. She studied him for a long breath. "You hear about the notice?" He nodded. "Yes, ma'am." Her gaze flicked down to the horse, then back up to him. "You still ride?" "Every day." "You mend fence." "Better than I talk." That earned the faintest smile, not enough to soften her, but enough to let the moment breathe. "You can start with the north line," she said. "Tools are in the shed. Don't rush it. I've had enough of men who rush things." He nodded again. Simple, respectful. No handshake, no small talk. Just understanding. The kind that doesn't need to be named. The first days passed in rhythm. Elias worked from dawn till dusk, the sun marking time across his shoulders. The fence had been beaten by storms, wind, and neglect, but he treated each post like a small promise. Slow, careful, lasting. Clara watched from a distance. She did her own work, feeding stock, hauling water, fixing the roof shingles that kept slipping in the wind. Sometimes she'd pass him a canteen without a word. Sometimes he'd leave a bucket of nails refilled and waiting by her porch. They spoke little. And yet, something unspoken moved between them. Not attraction, not yet, but a recognition. Two souls weathered by the same storm, standing in the same rain, without complaint. One afternoon, while repairing a section near the creek, Elias saw her struggling with a stubborn gate hinge. He walked over quietly, took the wrench from her hand, and finished the job in silence. When it was done, she said, "You didn't have to." He wiped the sweat from his brow, eyes soft beneath the brim of his hat. "Didn't want to see it beat you." She looked at him then, a long, steady look that said she wasn't used to kindness that didn't come with a price. Nights on the ranch were cold. The wind rattled the shutters, and the stars burned clear and cruel. Elias stayed in the small bunkhouse near the barn. Through the thin walls, he could sometimes hear the sound of a piano, faint, uneven. Clara played alone, not for beauty, for memory. On the third night, after a long day mending the eastern fence, he walked up to the porch to return her tools. She was sitting there, half in shadow, half in starlight, cradling a cup of coffee that had long gone cold. "You ever miss the noise?" she asked. Not looking up, he sat on the steps below her, boots resting on the dust. "Used to. Not anymore." The noise never said much worth hearing. She nodded slowly. "My husband liked noise. He thought quiet meant weakness." Elias didn't answer. Sometimes silence says the right thing. She took a slow breath. "He died in a storm 3 winters ago. Tried to prove he could outlast the wind. I stayed. Been outlasting it ever since." The stars above flickered like breath held too long. "I'm sorry," Elias said, finally. "Don't be." she replied, her voice low, almost gentle. Some things go so others can stay. They sat like that a while, not as man and woman, not yet, just two souls keeping company with the dark. The next morning, frost silvered the ground again. Elias was already at work when Clara brought him a plate of biscuits and dried meat that he nodded his thanks. But she lingered, arms crossed, watching the slow care he gave to every wire, every knot. Most men try to finish quick, she said. Most fences fall quick, he answered. That earned another small smile. Then, quieter, she said, I don't need fancy, Elias. I need honest. He stopped mid-knot. The morning light caught her face, softened the edges, turned her eyes from steel to warmth. He didn't reply. Couldn't find words steady enough. But something in his chest shifted, as if the years had just taken a breath again. Clara turned and walked back toward the house, her shadow long across the frost. Elias watched her go, his gloved hands resting against the cool wire. He realized he hadn't felt this kind of silence in years. Not the empty kind, but the kind that feels full. The kind that listens back. That evening, as the sky went violet and gold, he stood by the corral, watching the horses move slow in the fading light. The air smelled of sage and smoke. The cabin windows glowed warm behind him. For the first time in a long while, Elias Boone didn't feel forgotten. Not by the land. Not by life. Somewhere between her steady voice and his quiet hands, something wordless was taking root. A promise that maybe both of them had one more season left worth living. Winter came early that year, rolling down from the peaks like a slow avalanche of gray sky and cold memory. The first snow fell soft, almost gentle, a warning whispered rather than shouted. By the time Elias and Clara realized the season had come to stay, the world was already white and still as held breath. The fences they had mended disappeared under drifts. The creek froze into glass. The cattle huddled close in the low field, their breaths steaming like ghosts in the dawn. Elias rose before daylight every morning. His joints ached with the kind of honesty that only cold can bring, but he worked through it, steady and silent. Clara tried to do the same, though the weight of the storm pressed heavy on her, not just on her shoulders, but somewhere deep inside where loss had already made a home. For a while, they managed. Then the supplies began to thin, flour near gone, coffee stretching thin as courage. And the youngest hand they'd taken in, a wiry boy named Tommy, no more than 17, came down with frostbite after trying to bring in the herd alone. Clara sat by his bedside, wrapping his hands in rags dipped in warm water. Elias stayed near the fire, repairing broken harness straps in silence. The boy moaned once in his fever. Clara's face softened with something fierce and tender. He reminds me of my brother, she said quietly. Too proud to ask for help until the world made him. Elias nodded. Pride's a lonely fire. Burns quick, leaves nothing warm behind. She looked at him for a moment, then went back to tending the boy. The wind pressed against the window panes, howling to be let in. A few days later, a sound broke the stillness. Hooves on frozen ground. Elias stepped outside to see a man riding through the gate, dressed finer than the snow deserved. Hollis Trent, the banker from town. The kind of man whose boots stayed polished even in the mud. That he tipped his hat to Clara when she came out, his smile polite but sharp. Mrs. Vale, he said, I was riding by and thought I'd remind you. Your payment's due. Winter don't pause the bank. She stiffened. You'll have it after thaw. We've had hard weather. Everyone's had hard weather, he said lightly, glancing toward Elias. I see you've taken on help. The pause was deliberate, the smirk cruel. Elias said nothing. He simply met the man's eyes, calm, unreadable, the kind of stare that made loud men falter. Hollis shifted in his saddle. There's another way, you know. You could sell early. Let the land rest. Or, his voice softened, oily. You could marry someone with steady means. I'd make sure this place was cared for. Clara's face didn't change, but something in the air did, the kind of stillness before a gunshot. I think we're done here, she said. The banker's smile cracked. Be sensible, Clara. You can't run a ranch with sentiment in an old man's hands. Elias's voice came quiet. Like thunder you feel more than hear. She can run it with truth. That's more than you've got. Hollis laughed, short, mean, and rode off, leaving behind a spray of snow and insult. For a long time after, the ranch stayed silent. Clara worked harder, her face paler each day. Elias fixed what broke, often before she asked. The boy began to heal, but the food ran lower still. One morning, the roof of the barn gave under the weight of snow. The sound tore through the valley like a gunshot. Elias ran out bareheaded, the cold biting his face, and climbed up with hammer and boards before anyone could stop him. Elias, wait, Clara called, her voice sharp with worry. He didn't. Some men need motion more than safety. The ladder creaked. The snow slid around him in sheets. Wind screamed like a living thing. He nailed through it all, steady, patient, until his foot slipped and the world tilted beneath him. He caught the beam with one hand, his body swinging over the edge. Below, the ground looked soft but promised bone. Elias. Clara's voice cut through the storm. She grabbed a rope, ran into the snow, and threw it up to him. Her hands bled on the hemp, her breath turning to mist with every cry. He caught it. She pulled, every muscle in her trembling arms straining, her boots slipping in the ice. For a heartbeat, time froze. Then the rope went taut, and he was on solid ground again. They stood there, chest to chest, breathless in the swirling white. Her hand was still gripping his coat, knuckles pale, eyes wide and wet. "You fool," she whispered, her voice breaking in half between anger and relief. "I said I don't need fancy, but I do need you." The storm went quiet then, as if it had been waiting to hear those words. That night, they sat by the fire, both too tired to speak. The boy slept, the wind eased, and for the first time all winter, warmth seemed to stay in the room. Clara's head rested lightly against Elias's shoulder. He didn't move, didn't speak. The moment didn't ask for words. Outside, the snow melted slow against the roof, dripping in rhythm, soft and steady, like the sound of two hearts learning to trust the same silence. In the quiet flicker of firelight, she looked up once and said, "You've seen a lot of storms, haven't you?" He nodded. "They all pass. The trick's to stay long enough to see the sun again." Her eyes softened. "You make it sound simple." "It is," he said. "Simple's just another word for true." When dawn came, pale and clean, Elias stepped outside. The world was still blanketed in white, but something inside him had shifted, a quiet that didn't feel lonely anymore. He turned toward the fence line they had built together, each post standing proud under the frost. For the first time in years, he felt part of something that might outlast him. Behind him, Clara's voice carried across the cold. "Coffee's on," she called softly. "If you're done talking to the wind." He smiled. "It listens better than most." She laughed, really laughed, and it sounded like sunlight breaking through clouds. And that was how they weathered the rest of that long, bitter winter, not by fighting it, but by outlasting it together. By believing that quiet could be strong and strength could be kind. When spring came, it did not rush. It crept through the valley like an apology, slow, hesitant, soft. The snow melted in size, revealing the stubborn green beneath. Streams that had slept all winter began to hum again, and the land took its first breath of warmth in months. Elias Boone stood on the porch of the Vale Ranch, hat in hand, watching the thaw crawl down from the mountains. The fences still stood, proud and straight, the boards patched by his own hands. The cattle wandered free again, their low calls floating through the bright, thin air. Inside the house, Clara was baking bread. The smell drifted out through the open window, warm and sweet, mixing with the scent of damp soil and pine. Her hair was looser now, no longer pulled back in the tight knot of duty. There was color in her face again, not youth, exactly, but peace wearing her shape. They had survived the winter, not by strength, but by stillness, the kind that bends but does not break. In town, word of the banker's threat had spread. Hollis Trent did not like to lose, least of all to silence. He came again in late spring, this time not alone. 2 riders trailed behind him, men whose eyes looked hard and hollow from years of doing someone else's bidding. The morning was calm when they arrived. Elias was fixing the corral gate. Clara was tending to the hens. The sound of hooves broke the quiet, and the dog began to bark low and steady. Trent swung down from his horse, spurs clinking sharp against the dust. His smile was too wide for the moment. "Morning, Mrs. Vale," he called. "Morning, Boone. I've come for the deed. The loan's past due." Clara straightened, wiping her hands on her apron. "You'll get your money after the cattle sell next month." "That's not how time works," he said smoothly. "You've had your chances. Now it's my turn to collect." He nodded to his men. They began to move toward the barn. Elias set down his hammer, his jaw tightening. He walked slowly, deliberately, to stand between Trent and the barn door. "This ranch isn't yours," he said, his voice calm as a still pond. Trent laughed. "You think you can stop me, old man?" Elias didn't answer right away. He met the banker's eyes, not angry, just steady, the kind of quiet that turns men's voices small. "I don't think," he said finally. "I know." For a moment, nothing moved. Even the wind seemed to pause, waiting to see what kind of man Elias Boone still was. Then something unexpected happened. From the trail behind them came the sound of more hooves. The townsfolk from Dry Creek, led by the blacksmith, the grocer, and the male driver who owed Clara kindness for years past. They had heard rumors that the banker was coming, and they came not for a fight, but for truth. They lined the fence line, silent but present. Faces weathered, hands rough, hearts stubborn. Trent looked around. His smirk faltered. "You people don't want trouble," he said. The blacksmith stepped forward. "We don't want trouble," he agreed. "But we don't want bullies neither." Elias didn't move. He didn't have to. His stillness said everything. Trent's men hesitated, then turned their horses. The banker cursed under his breath, realizing he had already lost, not to a gun or a threat, but to quiet that refused to yield. That he mounted up, his voice bitter. "You'll regret this, Boone." "You too, Clara." Elias just tipped his hat. "No, we won't." They rode away in a storm of dust and shame. After they were gone, the town stayed for coffee and stew. Laughter began to fill the yard, small at first, then full and bright, like warmth rediscovering its voice. Clara's porch, once silent as prayer, became a place of stories again. When the last wagon rolled back toward Dry Creek and twilight spilled over the land, Elias stayed behind on the porch. The mountains glowed red and gold in the dying light. Clara came out beside him, 2 cups of coffee in her hands. She passed one to him without a word. They stood in the hush, the kind of quiet that doesn't ask to be broken. "I used to think peace was something you found when you stopped moving," she said softly. "But maybe it's what you build, one small honest day at a time." Elias nodded, his eyes on the horizon. "The noise always dies down sooner or later. What's left after, that's who you really are." She smiled at that. "And who are you, Elias Boone?" He took a slow sip, the steam curling around his face. "Just a man who still believes in quiet." Her hand found his, fingers worn but sure. That summer, the ranch came alive again. Calves were born, fences held, and the house that once echoed with loneliness now hummed with the gentle sounds of work and laughter. Tommy, the boy who nearly lost his hands to frostbite, rode out each morning strong and sure. Clara let Elias handle the herd while she rebuilt her garden, the rows neat and proud. And every evening, as the sun sank behind the ridge, they sat together on the porch. No words, no plans, just the slow rhythm of 2 lives that had finally found the same pace. The valley changed around them. The wind softened. The land remembered kindness. Sometimes, travelers passing through would stop and ask how the place had survived when so many others fell. Clara would only smile and say, "We had help. Someone steady." But the truth ran deeper. It wasn't just Elias who saved the ranch. It was what he carried. That stillness, that faith that quiet things endure longer than loud ones. When autumn came again, gold in the leaves and peace in the air, Elias walked the fence one last time before dusk. The posts were strong, the wire tight. Hickory grazed nearby, gray-muzzled but content. He paused at the edge of the field, where the mountains framed the horizon like old sentinels. The wind touched his hat brim. Cool and familiar, he thought of all the noise he'd outlived. Men shouting, years rushing, hearts breaking, and smiled to himself. Some lives, he realized, don't fade. They settle. They find their place in the silence they've earned. As the sun sank low, Clara joined him, her hand resting lightly on his arm. "Still walking fences?" she asked. "Still believing they hold," he said. She leaned against him, and together they watched the light die slow and gentle over the hills in O grand ending. No fanfare, just quiet, honest, unbreakable enough.